Welcome to the Rock Ag Podcast. This is your host, Garrett Coffey, Ag and Natural Resource Agent for the University of Kentucky in Rockcastle County. Today we will be joined by Dr. Bob Coleman, University of Kentucky Equine Specialist, to talk about a pre-riding equipment check on our horses. Where do we need to check? What do we need to look for? And let's make sure that ourselves as well as our equine partners are ready to ride before we leave the barn. So let's check the bridle, Dr. Bob. What are we going to do when we check the bridle?
I like to look at it to see that, it's sitting balanced in the horse's mouth. And depending on what kind of bridle you like, some of us like one-ear bridles. Some of us like that brow band bridle, which is probably for trail riding, a much better choice. It's a lot more secure because you have a throat latch. Now you can get one-ear bridles that have throat latches. They're not as common now as they used to be. There's still some of them that are out there. The biggest problem with some of those is they have such a shaped ear piece that you really have to be careful in making sure that it fits right so that you're not rubbing the horse and putting them in an uncomfortable place. But I want to make sure that things are fitting. I'm going to check depending on my horse. There's the rules of thumb. How many wrinkles should there be? That's related to your horse. There isn't it can be 0, 1, or 2. There's some horses don't like very much pressure up in the corners of their mouth. So, I ride a horse that rides with 1 wrinkle.
Yeah.
And he likes to hold the bit a little bit. So I check to make sure I've got my 1 wrinkle. I'm going to, on his throat latch, I'm going to make sure that there's enough room for probably 3 or 4 fingers, making sure that it fits. And then if I'm using a curb bit, I'm going to double check my curb strap. And again, it's going to be a little bit related to the horse and what I need, but generally 2 fingers between his chin and the curb chain. For some horses that if they need a little quicker signal and you don't want to be yarding on them all the time, you might have it a little bit tighter. Or you might have one of those horses that doesn't like a lot of pressure on his chin, and you might have a little bit more. But realize that the more fingers you can put between his chin and that curb chain, the less leverage you're going to have. But if he's comfortable with that and you're comfortable with that, then I think you should be all right.
So it's kind of just knowing your horse. And I mean, you hear everybody's got a different opinion. And like you said, there's wrinkles and there's, they need to carry it this way and, maybe even a little looser. And, I've had a guy tell me one time that, maybe even leave it just a little bit loose on a young horse and he kind of learns to carry that bit and, and you hear all kinds of stuff. So mainly what you're telling me is that just know your horse and know where that bridle sits on the horse. And before you get in, make sure that it's adjusted that way.
That's right. And one of the things that I do, and I don't even know where I learned this, but when I put the bridle on, my bridle's already, and I have buckles on both sides of my bridles because that's just the way it has to be for me. But I have it down a hole on both sides.
Yeah.
So it's actually pretty loose when it's on them. And then I have to go through the whole process of adjusting it up 1 hole on each side. And while I'm doing that, I'm making sure that the bridle's fitting on him comfortably. And then my curb chain's where I need it to be. It's the right tightness. And my throat latch is where I need it to be. And it's the right tightness for him. So it's just part of the process of making that check that if I got everything where I want it to be.
Okay. So whenever we step back 1 step from the head of the horse, or maybe 2 steps, depending on what kind of horse you're riding, we get back to the saddle and probably, if your cinch is too loose, that's going to be pretty easy to determine. But a lot of times, it's how tight do you need to make that front cinch? And also, well, let's talk about the front cinch first, and then we'll step on back to the back. But so, I hear, some people, I mean, they can cut a horse in 2. I mean, I'll be honest with you, I can lay down on that Latigo and I can pretty well cut a horse in 2, but maybe some of the ladies that are riding maybe have a hard time getting it tight enough. So where does that fall? What do we need to make sure that looks like?
Well, it's certainly going to depend on the horse. Like everything, it always depends on the horse. We've got a good set of withers on them. We got the right kind of pad. We probably don't need to tighten it as much. I think in a lot of cases, you're right. A lot of people think they got to cut them in two.
Yeah.
And I think for a lot of horses, you don't. I always put my hand as I'm pulling on my Latigo. I always have my hand between the Latigo and the horse because you don't need both hands to tighten the Latigo.
Right.
You shouldn't.
You shouldn't.
And there's those new cinches that are out there that have the roller on the buckle.
Yeah.
It's a lot easier to pull on that.
Yeah.
So I actually try to keep my hand in there, and when my hand's tight to the horse and the cinch, that's kind of where on my horse that's about where he likes it, and that's where I like it. And then I might do it up. I always time my cinches off. I tie my Latigos off. Yeah, I have a buckle, but I always tie mine off because I'm just a nervous Nelly.
Yeah.
I'd rather know that it's secure, and then I move them around a little bit before I get on, and I just double check to see, can I get my hand in there? Is it comfortable? Does he appear to be comfortable? And certainly there are some horses, and I think if you do it a little gentler and kinder and not go reefing on it and cutting them in two, that I think a lot of times those horses aren't going to blow up on you. There's still some that will.
Yeah.
They puff right up. But, back in the old days when we were doing up the Latigo, what did we do? Well, we started pulling on it, and then we kneed him in the belly so that he'd exhale.
Yeah.
There's probably still two of those horses out there that you got to be a little careful. But I think that's what I do is that, and I've learned that from a couple of people that I've ridden with, that, again, the saddle seems to sit all right with what we're doing. If I'm going up and downhill on somebody else's horse, I'm going to ask that person whose horse I'm riding is, how tight do you want this? How tight does this need to be for this particular horse? And rather than just, we had one that was on our equestrian team that we got to borrow, and I guarantee you tighten it too much on her, you better have a really deep seat and a seat belt because she's going to pile you.
Yeah.
She hated it being tight. And I think got to be careful with that.
I have a horse that she's a great horse, but I know that I set that saddle up there, and I just touch the cinch to her because two things is she's going to blow up, and the second is if I try to cut her in half with it right off the bat, she's going to act bad. So I throw the saddle up, I just pull the cinch against her, and I walk off and leave her. And actually, a lot of times I'll actually untie her and take her out, maybe lunge her, walk her a little bit. I come back, tighten that up again, and like you said, I'm not trying to cut her in half with it, but just cinch that up and, make that where it needs to be the second time. And once she relaxes, she's exhaled. And so I think that, a lot of times that works really well on a lot of different horses, actually, instead of just trying to cut them in half.
It's a old cowboy told me, if you want to go fast someplace, just slow down.
Yeah, there you go.
And I think what you've just described, Garrett, is exactly that. Take a few minutes, let them be comfortable. Make sure it's in the right place, and think about some of that rather than just. And I always go around and look on the on the other side too, and just make sure where my kind of balance with my rings of my cinch, are they kind of in the same place on the horse. Yeah. Sometimes if it looks like that left side cinch ring is getting awful close to the saddle, then I know I've got to kind of back off and go around and readjust my offside as well, because I like to try to keep it as balanced as I can.
So one thing that I like to do is every saddle that I have and every horse that I own is trained to a back cinch. I know obviously English riders probably don't even know what a back cinch is. There's a lot of different opinions about that, but sometimes I see, I like to keep mine, pretty snug against the horse's belly. I kind of feel like that's why that's there. I'm obviously not tightening that down as much as I do the front cinch, but if we look at that back cinch, sometimes I see people riding them, and I'll be honest, I could put my leg between the back cinch and the horse, the horse's belly. It's hanging down 6-8 inches. And so I really don't feel like that's probably correct either. I don't imagine. So touch on that a little bit.
Having had the experience of seeing a horse get his foot between his belly and that back cinch, they're really hard to undo.
Yeah.
In that good stout leather that's back there, it doesn't cut well,
Yeah.
and it's a wreck. So I'm like you. I want it again. I'm going to probably have it a little tighter, but I still want to maybe get my hand in there without.
Yeah.
But I want it. It's there for you're exactly right. It's there for a reason. It's to keep the saddle from moving. Um, Typically, a lot of people that rope have a back cinch because they don't want the back of the saddle to get pitched forward when the rope tightens on what they've caught.
Yeah.
But the same holds true when you're riding up and downhill. You want that saddle to not be moving a lot. And it's just a whole lot easier, I think, on the horse. Probably helps you to not have to have that front cinch quite so tight.
Right.
Um, and so do it up. But like you, I see lots of people going down the trail and it, or in lots of other places. I mean, people that have the back cinch have never taught their horse to wear one.
Yeah.
And so if you now have a saddle with a back cinch and it's the first time you're going on a lovely trail ride out in eastern Kentucky, that's not the time to crank it down and cut him in two at the back, because be careful. That's also another piece of equipment you need to double check and make sure that your hobble that holds the front cinch to the back cinch is intact and in good shape and exists, because it's also there for a reason, and make sure that it's in good shape and not going to come apart.
Make sure that our back cinch doesn't turn into a flank strap, right?
Exactly, because there's some horses that probably don't care, but there's some horses that they really do care.
That's right. So kind of as we're talking about wrapping up here, one last thing that I'd like to speak on is using halters while you're riding. Some people I see, I like to ride. I do a lot of trail riding and sometimes even overnight some pack trips, and a lot of times it's easier just to leave that halter under your bridle. Maybe even have the rope up there hooked up and just draped over the saddle horn and that kind of thing. And is that good? Should we just pack our bridles in the saddlebags? How do you feel about that?
Um, Kind of a mixed thing. I think that it actually makes good sense to have the halter on. Again, like everything else, making sure that it fits. I actually saw something recently. Somebody was showing us how to lead a horse, and I couldn't believe where the halter was because it was hanging down. Um, you wouldn't have been able to put the bridle on this horse because that's how low the halter was hanging.
Yeah.
You could see the corner of his mouth through the ring on the halter, which I thought that's a little. I'd put. I mean, that doesn't bother me at all. I think it is great convenience to do that. Again, I'd like make sure the halter is fitting properly and we're not putting too much on the horse. And whether you want to have the lead shank on, probably not a bad idea. Just make sure that you've got it attached and controlled so that it's not going to get caught in something and all of a sudden we've got the halter dragging the horse off to the left when you think you're going right.
Yeah.
But paying attention to that, I think, is a good idea. I think for a lot of people, having the halter on, so if you stop somewhere and you're going to pull the bridle off that horse, you've already got him controlled.
Yeah.
And you might have a really, really broke horse in the arena.
Right.
But out on the trail, there's a whole lot. It's a new world, and I'd be a little concerned about that. So
Yeah.
I don't think it's such a bad thing. It's like everything else, make sure it fits. Make sure your horse is accustomed to it. If you like rope halters, great. If you like nylon halters, great. I think in this case, having a leather halter might just be a lot more material that you have to deal with and trying to keep it, particularly over the pole of the horse,
Yeah.
comfortable for them. But I don't think it's a bad thing, and having a good lead rope that the snap's good, or that it's attached through the ring with some of the rope halters that the lead shank comes already attached. just make sure that everything is in good shape so that it does what you want it to do.
Okay. Well, I think we're almost ready to ride, Dr. Bob.
I think so.
I'm just about ready to go. So, any last words before we wrap up?
Just take that few minutes and make sure everything is the way you want it to be. I think a lot of times we spend, and I think of a gentleman that was doing some dental work on my horse, and he said, "So, how often do you look in his mouth?" I said, "Well, every time I put the bit in his mouth." He said, "You look in both sides?" I said, "Well, of course not." He said, "You need to start looking on both sides of your horse." So
Yeah.
that just made me think of, and so I do that now when I go to ride.
Yeah.
I check both sides. I make sure that things are fitting the way I want them to. Like you, I might lunge mine a little bit before I get on. Uh, that's part of the whole process. And I go back through and double check my cinch. I make sure everything. There's even times that I will double check to make sure my stirrups are the right length.
Yeah.
Even though nobody else rides in my saddle,
Yeah.
I still make sure that everything is the way I want it to be. And maybe it's being a little too safety conscious, but I'm thinking that it's not such a bad plan. Be safe.
Yes, sir. Well, thanks for joining us today. And in the words of Dr. Coleman, check both sides of your horse before you take off. Thanks for joining us today, Dr. Coleman.
You bet. Thanks, Garrett.
Thanks for listening to the Rock Egg Podcast. For more information on the content of this podcast, please contact Garrett Coffey at the Rockcastle County Extension Office. Make sure and like and subscribe to our podcast.